Lieutenant Guy Bordelon could not see the thing he was trying to kill. He could only feel it. A shape somewhere ahead in the black, a whisper of engine noise swallowed by his own, and a smudge on a small radar screen tied to the leading edge of his wing. It was shortly before midnight on the night of June 29th into June 30th, 1953. He was flying a propeller fighter over the dark hills of central Korea, and a ground controller far behind him was reading faint blips on a scope and speaking them into his ears. "Come left. Steady. He is right in front of you now." Then the enemy gunner opened fire. Tracer lashed across the darkness to Bordelon's left and below, a spray of machine gun rounds from the rear seat of an aircraft he still could not clearly see. That fire told him everything he needed to know. It told him the enemy had spotted him. It told him the range was almost nothing. And it told him that the small, slow, almost comical machine ahead of him had teeth. Bordelon eased his heavy blue Corsair into position behind the muzzle flashes, close enough now to make out the silhouette against the stars, close enough that a single mistake meant a collision no one would survive. He pressed the trigger. 4 20mm cannon fired at once, and the little aircraft ahead of him came apart and fell burning into the mountains below. That was the first. Within minutes, there would be a second. Over the next 18 days, there would be 5 in all, and those 5 would make this soft-spoken officer from Louisiana into something that no other man in the entire Korean War would ever become. Here is the strange part, the part that makes this story worth your time. For nearly 3 years, the United States and its allies had owned the skies over Korea by day. American air power ruled the daylight so completely that enemy pilots learned to fear the sun. And yet, after dark, that supremacy simply melted away. Almost every night, cheap little aircraft built from wood and canvas, some of them of a design older than the men flying them, droned over United Nations airfields and dropped bombs on sleeping soldiers. They wrecked parked aircraft. They set fire to fuel. They killed men in their cots. And the most advanced air force on Earth, an air force flying machines that could pass the speed of sound in a dive, could not lay a glove on them. The weapon that finally clawed the night back was not a jet. It was not a new radar. It was not a secret prototype rushed out of a laboratory. It was a propeller plane, a design with its roots in the last war, exactly the kind of aircraft the Navy was already planning to send to the scrapyard. The answer to the most modern problem in the sky turned out to be a machine the world had already decided was obsolete. And to understand how one man in an old fighter cracked a puzzle that had humiliated an entire air force, we have to go back to the beginning, to the night the raiders first appeared, and to the reason that nothing thrown at them seemed to work. Before we go on, I want to ask you something directly. This is Cold War Impact. We are a small channel that makes carefully researched military history, and lately the numbers have been working against us. Fewer people are seeing these videos than before. If you find this story worth your time, the single most helpful thing you can do is tap subscribe, leave even a short comment, and pass the video along to someone who loves history the way you do. Every comment, every share, and every new subscriber tells the platform that this kind of careful work deserves an audience. It costs you nothing, and it keeps these deep dives alive. Thank you. Now let us go back to Korea and to the little aircraft that terrorized an army. They came first in the closing months of 1950. United Nations troops lay in their tents and bunkers, and out of the dark drifted a sound that nobody who heard it ever forgot. It was a soft, uneven putter like a distant lawnmower or a labouring washing machine growing closer and then circling somewhere overhead. The men gave the sound a name. They called the visitor Bed Check Charlie because he came around after lights out, the way a sergeant might walk the barracks at night to see who was in his bunk. Others called him Washing Machine Charlie for the stuttering rhythm of the engine. The nickname was almost fond. What Charlie actually did was not fond at all. The aircraft making that sound was, in most cases, a Polikarpov Po-2. To call it merely old is to be kind. The design dated back to 1928. It was a 2-seat biplane, an open cockpit machine of wooden frame and fabric skin, powered by a small 5-cylinder engine of only about 100 horsepower. Its top speed was under 100 miles per hour, and in a stiff headwind, it could seem almost to hang motionless in the air. It carried no armor. It carried no self-sealing fuel tanks. It often carried no radio worth the name. By every measure that an engineer would use to judge a combat aircraft, it was a museum piece. And that, precisely, was what made it so dangerous. A machine built of wood and cloth returns almost no radar echo. The metal aircraft that the United Nations relied on for its own early warning painted bright and sharp on a screen. The Po-2 painted like a ghost, a faint smear if it showed at all. It flew low, hugging the ridgelines and the river valleys, sliding beneath the altitude where radar coverage could be trusted. It flew slowly, so slowly that it dropped below the speed at which most interceptors could even keep flying. And it could operate from almost nothing. A length of straight road, a strip of packed dirt, a harvested rice paddy. There was no grand enemy airbase to bomb, no single fuel depot to burn, no fixed target that a planner could strike to make the problem stop. The raiders could be scattered across the whole countryside and flown from anywhere a man could find a few hundred feet of open ground. The tactic itself was not new. The idea of using slow, quiet biplanes to rob an enemy of his sleep had been perfected a decade earlier on the Eastern Front of the Second World War. The Soviet Union had flown night harassment with the very same Po-2, and among the most famous of those units were the all-female regiments that the Germans came to call the Night Witches. Those pilots would throttle their engines back and glide over the German lines in near silence, and the first warning a soldier had was the whistle of a small bomb already on its way down. The Germans learned to dread the quiet between the puttering passes, and they threw everything they had at the problem, from searchlights to specially assigned fighters, and still they could not make it stop. The lesson of that campaign was absorbed carefully by the men who would later advise North Korea. A slow biplane in the dark was not a joke. It was a weapon that a great modern army could not easily answer. Now, over Korea, the same idea had come back to haunt a new enemy. The North Koreans, and behind them their Soviet advisors, understood exactly what they held. It was cheap. It was expendable. It was nearly impossible to catch. And even on the nights when it killed no one, it still worked, because a soldier who cannot sleep is a soldier who cannot fight well when the sun comes up. What makes the whole story more remarkable still is how little the North Koreans started with. When the war began in the summer of 1950, their air arm counted only around 18 of these Po-2 biplanes on strength. From that tiny handful of obsolete machines grew a campaign of harassment that would tie down interceptors, burn fuel, wreck aircraft, and gnaw at the nerves of the United Nations forces for the better part of 3 years. It was one of the great bargains in the history of air warfare. A few dozen aircraft that belonged in a museum bought the enemy a nightly hold over skies that were, by every other measure, completely lost to him. The damage was real, and it began early. In late 1950, a pair of these night raiders slipped over an airfield at Pyongyang, where a line of American fighters sat parked wingtip to wingtip. In a few minutes, they damaged nearly a dozen aircraft and left several fit only for salvage. It was an astonishing return on 2 flimsy biplanes and a handful of small bombs, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. The raiders could not win the war. They could not even seriously slow the daytime air campaign. But night after night, they levied attacks, paid in wrecked equipment, in lost sleep, in nerves worn to the bone, and every so often in blood. The insult only sharpened as the war ground on, because by then the United Nations Air Forces were not flying old machines of their own. They were flying the future. Over the northwest corner of Korea, in the stretch of sky the pilots christened MiG Alley, American jets fought the first great jet battles in the history of the world against the swept-wing MiG-15, many of them flown in secret by Soviet pilots who had cut their teeth in the Second World War. The premier American fighter there was the F-86 Sabre, a sleek and beautiful machine that could reach close to 690 miles per hour down near the deck. For decades afterward, the Air Force claimed that its Sabres had destroyed MiG-15s at a rate of roughly 10-1. Later, more careful study of the records, some of it drawing on Soviet archives, opened long after the war, pushed that figure sharply downward, closer to somewhere between about 1.5 and 2 enemy jets for every Sabre lost. Serious historians argue over the true ratio to this day, but whatever the exact number turns out to be, the point holds. The daytime air war over Korea was the cutting edge of 1950s technology. Fast and glamorous, and written about endlessly ever since. That daytime war had its own legends and its own vocabulary. American pilots came to speak of the most dangerous communist aces they faced as honchos, and one bloody stretch of the fighting was remembered afterward as the year of the Honcho, when experienced Soviet veterans flying the MiG-15 made the skies over the Yalu River genuinely deadly. This was the war the newsreels loved. Silver-swept wingjets turning and burning at the edge of the stratosphere, contrails scrawled across a blue sky, young men returning to base to chalk another kill beneath their canopies. It was modern, it was fast, and it was the future of air combat arriving all at once. And every one of those blindingly fast, cutting-edge machines was very nearly useless against a fabric biplane creeping through the dark at 80 miles per hour. That was the contradiction at the heart of the air war over Korea. The same nation that was writing the opening chapter of jet-age fighter combat by day could not solve a problem by night that would not have puzzled a pilot of the First World War. The future and the past were flying over the same country at the same time, and for a long and painful stretch, the past was winning after dark. The problem came down to pure arithmetic, and the arithmetic was cruel. A jet fighter is a creature of speed. It makes its lift by moving fast through the air, and when it slows down too far, its wings stop flying and it drops out of the sky in what pilots call a stall. To sit behind a PO too long enough to line up a shot, a jet had to throttle right back to the ragged edge of that stall, wallowing on the border of control. And even then it would sweep past the tiny, slow target within a few seconds and have to swing around and go hunting for it all over again. There is a well-documented case of an F-94 Starfire, a modern two-seat jet interceptor packed with radar, making 3 separate firing passes at a single PO-2 and failing every single time, simply unable to hold itself slow enough to kill the thing before flashing past. Picture the frustration of it. A crew strapped into one of the most sophisticated aircraft on the planet, hunting a machine their grandfathers would have recognized on sight and losing the fight. There is a famous story from this campaign that deserves to be told with care because it has grown taller in the retelling. On a night in early May of 1953, an F-94 Starfire was vectored after one of these slow raiders out near the coast. The jet went down and both crewmen were killed. The tale is often repeated as the only case in all of history of a biplane shooting down a jet fighter. The truth is more sobering and far less tidy. The most careful accounts conclude that the crew probably did bring down the raider and that moments later, having hauled their throttles back to that dangerous crawl in order to stay with such a slow target, their jet stalled with no height left to recover and fell into the sea. The fate of the enemy aircraft was never firmly confirmed. The loss of the jet is best understood not as a biplane's gun victory, but as the deadly price of trying to fly a fast machine as slowly as a farm plane. Either way, the lesson for the men on the ground was identical. Sending jets after Charlie was getting good crews killed for almost nothing in return. Now and then, the defenders did score, and it is only fair to the men who managed it to name what they did. In the summer of 1951, a bomber crew claimed one of the first confirmed night kills of a PO-2. Around the same time, night fighter crews of the Marine Corps, flying twin-engine piston fighters, bristling with radar and cannon, brought down a small number of raiders, one of the earliest of them crashing near the Han River after a patient stalk in the dark. Toward the start of 1953, a jet all-weather crew even managed a rare radar-guided night kill against a piston-engined Lavochkin fighter that they reportedly never actually laid eyes on, walking their shots onto the target by the glow of the scope alone. Those successes were real, and the men who earned them were highly skilled. But across the whole long span of the war, the confirmed tally of these hecklers brought down came to only about a dozen. A dozen over years against a threat that flew almost every night the weather allowed. That single number tells you the entire scale of the failure. The enemy could send Charlie up again and again and again, and pay almost nothing each time he did. The reason the failure ran so deep was that no easy fix existed. Anti-aircraft guns firing blind into the dark were as likely to hit friendly positions or sleeping civilians as they were to hit a target moving at 80 miles per hour a few hundred feet up. Searchlights could sometimes catch a raider, but a searchlight also announced exactly where the defenders were and gave a bomb aimer a gift of a reference point. Standing patrols of jets burned enormous quantities of fuel for almost no result, and, as the loss of that Starfire crew had shown, could get their own men killed in the attempt. Every obvious answer carried a cost that made it nearly useless, and the enemy, flying his cheap little machines from fields the United Nations could not even find, paid none of those costs in return. It was the kind of problem that grinds down a staff, because every proposed solution collapses on contact with the arithmetic. To feel the true weight of the thing, look closely at the summer of 1953, at the very end of the war, when the raids climbed to their peak. By then, the fighting on the ground had hardened into a savage stalemate along a line that barely moved, while diplomats argued at Panmunjom over the terms of a ceasefire. Both sides knew that an armistice was coming. Both sides scrambled to grab whatever advantage they could before the guns finally went quiet. The artillery fire that June set records for its sheer volume. The aircraft carriers offshore launched strikes at a furious pace, one of them flying a single-day record of well over 180 offensive sorties. And the night raiders flew as never before, striking the crowded rear areas around Seoul, the vital port of Incheon, and the ring of airfields that guarded the capital. Consider the raid on Suwon 2 years earlier, in June of 1951, as a taste of what these aircraft could do to a modern air force. In the small hours, a pair of Po-2s came over the airfield. When they left, one of the Air Force's own F-86 Sabres, the pride of the fleet, had been struck and burned out on the ground, and 8 more Sabres had been damaged, several of them seriously. 2 obsolete biplanes had reached out in the dark and mauled a squadron of the finest jet fighters America possessed, without ever having to fight them in the air. Think about the exchange rate buried in that single raid. Each of those Sabres represented an enormous investment of money, of industrial effort, of the time it took to train the pilot who flew it. Each Po-2 represented almost nothing at all: a little wood, a little fabric, an engine of modest power, and a brave or foolhardy crew. To trade 2 of the cheapest aircraft in the sky for the destruction and damage of 9 of the most expensive was a bargain so lopsided that no accountant of war could ignore it. That was the nightmare in miniature, and by the summer of 1953 it had swollen into something far worse. On the night of June 15th, raiders rattled the city of Seoul itself, and some of their bombs fell close to the residence of the South Korean president, Syngman Rhee. The very next night came the blow that made headlines around the world. Enemy aircraft found a fuel storage dump at Incheon and put their bombs squarely into it. The result was an inferno. Here the accounts genuinely diverge, and honesty demands that both be laid side by side rather than one chosen for drama. Wire service reporters at the time described a boiling column of flame that lit the sky for more than 20 miles, and a blaze that took 3 days to smother, and they placed the loss at around 5.5 million gallons of fuel. The United States Navy's own chronology of the war is more restrained and more precise. It records 2 enemy aircraft dropping 5 bombs on the fuel dump, and it counts the destruction in drums. Tens of thousands of large drums and thousands of smaller cans of petroleum products consumed by the fire. Even the number of attacking aircraft is reported differently from source to source, somewhere between 2 and 4. What no account disputes is the essential, humiliating fact. A tiny number of obsolete aircraft, flown by men the United Nations could not catch, had reached into a supposedly secure rear area and set a substantial part of an army's fuel supply ablaze. A few nights later, another raid on Seoul killed civilians outright and shook the president's home once again. To understand why these raids stung so badly in that particular summer, you have to picture the strange, tense mood of the war's final weeks. The ceasefire talks had dragged on for 2 years, and both the fighting and the diplomacy had grown poisonous. In the middle of June 1953, the South Korean president Syngman Rhee, who bitterly opposed any armistice that left his country divided, abruptly ordered the release of tens of thousands of enemy prisoners of war who did not wish to be sent home, an act that stunned his American allies and very nearly blew the fragile negotiations apart entirely. Roughly 27,000 prisoners walked free in a single stroke. The communist side was furious, the Americans were scrambling, and into that overheated atmosphere came the night raiders, striking the capital and the ports and killing civilians, as if to underline for the whole watching world that the United Nations could not even keep its own rear areas safe after dark. The timing turned a persistent military nuisance into a political humiliation. This was no longer a nuisance to be endured. This was a strategic embarrassment, and it was unfolding in front of the world's press in the final act of the war. Something had to change, and quickly. The commanders needed an aircraft that could do the one thing the jets could not. They needed something fast enough to reach a raider in a hurry, yet slow enough to fly in formation with a crawling biplane and hold a firing position long enough to kill it. They needed, in plain terms, a propeller fighter with a good radar and heavy guns. And the awkward truth was that the Air Force in Korea did not have one. Its night fighting had been handed over almost entirely to jets. The answer to this most modern of problems was going to have to come from the past, and it was going to have to come from the Navy. To see why that answer worked, you have to understand the machine and the man together, because in this story, the two are almost impossible to separate. The machine was the Chance Vought F4U5N Corsair. The Corsair was already a legend by the time it reached this fight. Its bent gull wings and its long, brutal nose had made it one of the finest fighters of the Second World War, a machine that Japanese pilots across the Pacific had learned to respect and to fear. But the version that mattered over Korea at night was a specialist, and the letter N was the key to it. The N stood for night. This Corsair carried a radar set housed in a smooth pod on the leading edge of its right wing, a set known as the APS-19, able to find another aircraft several miles out and guide its pilot in toward the kill. It carried an autopilot to ease the terrible strain of long, lonely patrols in the dark. It carried flame dampers fitted over its exhaust stacks so that the glare of its own engine would not blind the pilot and ruin the night vision he depended on to survive. And where the wartime Corsairs had carried heavy machine guns, this one carried 4 20mm cannon, firing explosive shells heavy enough that one well-aimed burst could tear a small aircraft to shreds in an instant. A winterized version of the same night fighter even carried de-icing equipment for the brutal Korean cold, a reminder of just how far this old airframe had been pushed to keep it useful. By the time of the Korean War, the Corsair had already found a new life, far from the glamorous work of shooting down other aircraft. All across the peninsula, day in and day out, Corsairs of the Navy and the Marine Corps flew as flying artillery, hauling bombs and rockets and napalm against enemy troops, bunkers, bridges and supply lines, and providing the close air support that ground troops came to rely on and to love. It was punishing, dangerous, deeply unglamorous work, and the sturdy old fighter proved better suited to it than almost anything else in the sky. That was the reputation the Corsair carried into 1953. It was the reliable workhorse, the aircraft you sent to do the hard and dirty jobs, not the sleek jet you sent to duel for the headlines. So there was a certain fitting irony in what happened next. The one air-to-air distinction of the entire Korean War that could never be matched by any jet, the one that would stand for all time, was won not by a sabre in the bright daylight of Mig Alley, but by this stout, propeller-driven veteran in the dark. Most important of all was the shape of the Corsair's performance. The Dash 5, driven by a huge Pratt & Whitney engine producing well over 2,000 horsepower, could reach around 470 miles per hour when the pilot demanded it. That was slow next to a jet, but it was far more than fast enough to run down any raider in the Korean sky. And here was the vital difference. Unlike a jet, the Corsair could also slow right down. It could pull its throttle back, hang on its great propeller, and match the crawling pace of a biplane without falling out of the air. It could turn tightly. It could sit in behind its prey and stay there. For this one peculiar mission, it was very nearly perfect. Fast enough to catch, slow enough to stay, and armed heavily enough to end the fight in a matter of seconds. The very qualities that had begun to make it seem old-fashioned. The propeller, the broad, forgiving wing, the gentle, low speed. Handling were precisely the qualities that made it deadly in the one place where the jets were helpless. The man was Guy Pierre Bourdillon Jr., born in the small city of Ruston, Louisiana, on the 1st of February 1922. He was an Eagle Scout as a boy and a pre-law student as a young man, first at a Louisiana college and then at Louisiana State University, before the widening war pulled him up toward the sky. He joined the Naval Reserve in the middle of 1942 as an aviation cadet, trained first in Georgia and then in Texas, and earned his wings and his commission in the spring of 1943. His path into the cockpit was not smooth. He very nearly washed out of flight training, and rather than being sent straight to the fleet, he was held back to serve as an instructor. Years later, he called that setback the best thing that ever happened to him, because in teaching others how to fly, he finally learned truly and deeply how to fly himself. When the Second World War ended, he had never once seen combat. He was flying a Wildcat fighter in training when the fighting stopped, and he chose to stay in the peacetime Navy. Korea at last gave him his war, though at first it gave it to him in a form he could hardly stand. Early in the conflict, he served aboard a heavy cruiser off the Korean coast, working on the staff as a gunnery officer, helping to direct the ship's big guns against targets ashore. In the slang of naval aviators, he had become a black shoe, a surface sailor, tied to a ship instead of a cockpit. For a trained and hungry fighter pilot, it was maddening duty. He later described it with real feeling as intensely frustrating for a man who had spent years learning to fly and fight in the air, only to find himself watching the war go by from the steel deck of a ship, while other men climbed into aeroplanes and went to meet it. The frustration mattered because it helps explain the hunger and the aggressiveness he would later show over Korea at night. He had been made to wait a very long time for his chance, first through a war he spent entirely in training and then through a posting that kept his feet on a deck. When the chance finally came, he was not going to let it slip. That chance arrived when he was assigned to a specialized outfit called Composite Squadron 3, a night and all-weather unit that flew the radar-equipped Corsairs and trained the small detachments that sailed aboard the fleet's carriers. This was a large parent squadron, and from it were carved the little teams, only about 5 aircraft, 5 pilots and a few dozen mechanics, ordnance men, and electronics technicians that each carrier carried to sea. Bordelon spent roughly a year mastering the difficult, unforgiving art of finding another aircraft in total darkness by radar and instinct alone. Then he shipped out aboard the aircraft carrier Princeton, leading one of those night fighter detachments, a handful of aircraft and pilots and the ground crews who kept them alive. His own Corsair had a name painted on its nose. He called it Annie Moe, after his wife Anne. That aircraft and the deep and particular bond between a pilot and the machine he trusts with his life in the dark would come to matter enormously before this story was over. For months, Bordelon and his detachment flew some of the most dangerous work of the entire war, and almost none of it was the kind of thing that makes headlines. It was low-level night attack against the roads and railways the enemy used to push men and supplies toward the front. He would take his Corsair down into the Black Valleys, often beginning his run from around 7,000 feet, and then dropping into a power-off dive so that the engine noise would not warn the target, hunting truck convoys in the dark. He learned to strike the lead vehicles first to halt a column in its tracks, and then to work over the trucks trapped helplessly behind. Enemy gunners threw up curtains of anti-aircraft fire to meet him, but the greatest danger of all was not the guns. It was the darkness itself, and the disorientation that comes when a pilot can no longer tell up from down, when a single bright explosion destroys his night vision and the invisible ground comes rushing up to meet him. Bordelon carried one hard rule out of that experience. Pull away from bright explosions, he said, because night blindness is difficult to shake off in a hurry, and it can kill you before it fades. For that grinding, hazardous, unglamorous work, he earned a string of air medals long before he ever fired a shot at another aircraft. Then, in late June of 1953, with the Incheon fires still fresh in everyone's memory and Seoul under threat almost every night, the call finally went out. The Air Force needed propeller night fighters and had none of its own to send, so the Navy lent it some. On the 25th of June, orders came down to place a small number of Corsair night fighters from the fleet under Air Force control for as long as they were needed, for the blunt reason, set down plainly in the Navy's own record, that the Air Force possessed no propeller-driven night fighters. Bordelon led his little detachment ashore. They flew first to the great airfield at Kimpo for briefings and orientation with the Air Force controllers who would guide them through their intercepts, and then they moved to a Marine airbase south of Seoul to fly their nightly patrols. They lived in screened huts that somehow drew clouds of biting black flies, and in the summer heat, the only way a man could sleep was to pull a heavy wool blanket over his head and simply sweat it out. It was a miserable, fly-ridden place from which to go and make history. The patrol area ran along the friendly side of the front lines. The plan itself was simple to describe and brutally hard to carry out. Ground radar would pick up an intruder and pass the bearing up to the orbiting Corsair. The pilot would swing onto the target, catch it on his own wing-mounted radar, and then close the distance until he could pick out the shape against the stars or catch the telltale glow of an exhaust, and only then would he open fire. Everything depended on 3 things coming together at once: the skill of the controller on the ground, the nerve of the pilot in the air, and the willingness of that pilot to fly straight in toward an armed enemy in total darkness until he was near enough to reach out and touch him. It is worth dwelling for a moment on just how hard that last stretch really was, because it is the part that the phrase night interception hides. The radar in the Corsair's wing was a fine instrument for its day, a real advance over the cruder sets carried by night fighters only a few years earlier, but it could not fire the guns for the pilot, and it could not tell him, in the final seconds, whether the shape swelling in front of him was friend or foe. At some point the machine had to hand the fight back to the man. He had to lift his eyes from the little glowing screen, find the enemy against the stars or by the faint blue flicker of an exhaust, judge a closing speed he could not measure, and hold his own aircraft rock steady while an alert enemy did everything in his power to throw him off. He had to do all of this at night, low over mountains, often inside the reach of ground fire, with his own night vision one bright flash away from being destroyed. A man could train for years and still find that the last 100 yards came down to instinct and nerve. This was the craft that Bordelon had spent a year of his life learning, and now, at last, he was going to get to use it against a real enemy. On that first night, the night of June 29th into June 30th, everything came together. The controller found a radar and fed Bordelon carefully onto its tail. It was a Yakovlev trainer, a Yak-18, a two-seat machine faster than a Po-2, and unlike the little biplane, fitted with a gun in its rear seat. Bordelon closed in, the rear gunner saw him coming and opened fire, and that was the lash of tracer across the night that opened this story. Bordelon held his course through it, settled his sights, and fired. The Yak-18 came apart and fell burning into the hills. The controller was already talking in his ears again, vectoring him onto a second intruder. He ran that one down as well, and his cannon shells broke it into several large burning pieces that tumbled away into the dark. 2 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single night, low over mountainous ground, against an enemy who shot back the whole way in. For that action, he would be awarded the Silver Star. The next night, he did it again. On the night of June 30 into the 1st of July, Bordelon was guided not onto one target, but 2, flying in a loose trail, one behind the other. These were not trainers, they were single-engine piston fighters built by the Lavochkin Design Bureau, real combat aircraft with real performance. And here, once more, honesty demands a careful word, because this is a point on which the records genuinely disagree, and a good history does not quietly paper over the seams. Bordelon's official citations describe these aircraft, and the one he would down 2 weeks later as Lavochkin 9s, the type known as the La 9. Bordelon himself, in the written account he set down years afterward, insisted they were the newer La 11. He admitted the two were very hard to tell apart in the dark, but he judged from the way they flew and performed that they were the later model. Careful historians since have mostly split the difference and simply written that they were Lavochkin piston fighters, La 9 or La 11, the exact type uncertain. That is the honest answer, and it is worth saying out loud. At night, at the very edge of a gun sight, a man identifies an enemy aircraft by its silhouette, and by the flicker of its exhaust flame, and absolute certainty is a luxury he rarely gets. Whatever their exact model, Bordelon killed them both. He slid in behind the rear aircraft in the trail and fired 2 short bursts, and it caught fire and dove straight down into the ground. Then he closed on the leader, which twisted hard, left and hard right, and clawed for altitude, trying desperately to escape, at one point fleeing toward the protected airspace set aside around the armistice negotiations, where Bordelon was forbidden to follow. He caught it before it could reach that sanctuary. The aircraft exploded and came apart in the air, and Bordelon followed the largest burning mass all the way down until it crashed near the wreck of his first kill of the night. Over so fast, he remembered thinking. 2 more enemy aircraft down. 4 in 2 nights. He now stood just 1 victory short of the mark that separates a good fighter pilot from an ace. And then, abruptly, the sky went quiet on him. For roughly 2 weeks, that 5th kill refused to come. The raiders still flew, but not into Bordelon's patch of sky, or not on the nights he happened to be aloft to meet them. There was one strange and tense encounter during that dry spell that tells you a great deal about the kind of man he was. He was guided one night onto a pair of enemy bombers, twin-engine Tupolev machines, and he maneuvered carefully into position to attack, and his guns would not fire. A fault deep in his electrical system had crippled his fire control, most likely a single disconnected wire. Another pilot might reasonably have broken off and turned for home. Bordelon did the opposite. He shoved his throttle forward, pulled out ahead of the two bombers, swung hard around to face them head-on, dropped his landing gear to slow himself down, and then switched on his bright landing light and flew straight at them out of the blackness like some furious apparition rushing out of the night. The enemy pilots panicked and scattered, one diving and one climbing away, their bombing run on Incheon broken up completely. He had driven off two bombers without firing a single shot, using nothing but raw nerve and a landing light. He shot down nothing that night. But it is not hard to see why the men around him had begun, half joking and half serious, to think of him as a little charmed, and why the nickname Lucky Pierre began to follow him around. The fifth victory finally came on the night of July 16 into July 17. It came, fittingly enough, because he went up to finish another man's fight. His wingman had launched to intercept a raider, but that pilot's radar had failed and left him effectively blind in the dark, so Bordelon took off to take the intercept over from him. The ground controller vectored him onto a fast-moving target, and Bordelon closed the range until he could make out the exhaust and identify yet another Lavochkin fighter. This enemy pilot was good and worse for Bordelon, he was warned. It appears the enemy had been listening in on the American radio frequency because the very instant the controller cleared Bordelon to fire, the Lavochkin broke into violent evasive maneuvers, hauling Bordelon down through bursts of anti-aircraft fire as it jinked and dove and twisted. Bordelon stayed glued to him through all of it. He waited for his moment, steadied the sight one last time and fired a single long burst. The enemy fighter exploded like a bomb going off in his face. One entire wing tore free and flashed past just above his canopy, close enough to feel. For a moment the flash blinded him utterly and he found himself flying on instinct alone in the dark with no vision at all. He reached out and flicked on his autopilot, and his Corsair, his Animaux, straightened herself and levelled off and flew on as though nothing at all had happened, carrying her blinded pilot safely through the night until his eyes recovered. He said afterward that he could have kissed her. He had trusted the old machine with his life, and she had kept it for him. That was the fifth. 2 Yak-18 trainers and 3 Lavochkin fighters, 5 enemy aircraft brought down in the dark across 18 days. Guy Bordelon was an ace. Now, it is worth pausing to understand exactly what that word meant in this particular case, because it is easy to say and surprisingly hard to grasp just how singular an achievement it was. The Korean War produced a good many aces. Very nearly all of them were jet pilots who won their laurels in the swirling daylight dogfights of MiG Alley, flying sabres against MiGs at the very top of the sky. Bordelon belonged to none of that world. He was the only ace the United States Navy produced in the entire Korean War. He was the only American to become an ace flying a propeller aircraft in that war, at the exact moment in history when the propeller was giving way to the jet. He was the only American night fighter ace of the whole conflict. And he holds a distinction that can now never be taken from him and never be repeated by anyone, because the very technology that made it possible has vanished from the world's air forces forever. He was the last American ever to become an ace flying a piston-engined aircraft. There will not be another. That category is closed for all time. Every one of those claims has been checked against the official records, and every one of them stands. For his 5 victories, and for the plain courage of flying straight at armed enemies in the dark, Bordelon received his nation's high decorations. The 5th kill, the one that made him an ace, brought him the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest award for valor. In a small but telling gesture, it was presented to him in Korea by the commanding general of the very Air Force he had come ashore to help. One service quietly acknowledging a man of another who had solved a problem it could not solve for itself. His earlier kills brought him 2 silver stars. The language of those citations is careful and precise, and it describes an enemy that returned his fire and took violent evasive action at dangerously low altitude over mountainous terrain. That is the dry, exact wording of the official record, and it matches, almost beat for beat, the story that Bordelon himself would tell. The raids did not stop entirely on the night that Bordelon became an ace, and it would be false to suggest they did. The problem of the slow night raider was never solved by any single silver bullet, not even by him. But a message had been sent, and it had been received on both sides of the line. Propeller night fighters, flown by skilled crews and steered by good controllers, could reach up into the dark and pull the raiders down out of it. The nights were no longer free of cost for the enemy. And in any case, the whole desperate episode was now racing toward its close because the war itself was almost over. The armistice that finally ended the fighting was signed at Panmunjom on the 27th of July, 1953, only 10 days after Bourdalone's final kill. The agreement was signed at 10 in the morning, and that same night, at 10 in the evening, the guns fell silent across the whole peninsula after 3 years of war. There is a coda to the story of the aircraft, and Bourdalogne plainly relished telling it in his later years. Annie Moe, the Corsair that had carried him to all 5 of his victories and then flown him home blind and safe, did not last long after her moment of glory. Not long after that final kill, she was wrecked in a takeoff accident. And the pilot at the controls when it happened was not a Navy man at all, but an Air Force reservist who had borrowed her. Bourdalogne, a Navy pilot to the marrow of his bones, seems to have taken a certain dry satisfaction at reunions in the decades that followed in pointing out that his famous fighter had met her end in Air Force hands rather than in his own. As for the man himself, he did what quiet professionals almost always do. He went back to work. Later that same year, he sailed for Europe to teach French naval pilots how to fly the Corsair, passing along everything the old airframe had taught him. Then he came home to a long career of command and staff assignments. During the Vietnam era, he taught survival skills to combat pilots and was honoured as one of the very best instructors of his kind. Near the end of his service, he worked on the recovery of returning astronauts from the Apollo space program, an almost poetic final chapter for a man whose entire life had been built around bringing people safely back down out of the sky. He retired at last as a commander, having flown more than 15,000 hours over the course of his life. He died in Louisiana in December of 2002 at the age of 80, survived by the wife whose name he had once painted on the nose of his fighter and by their 3 children. He had been married to her for very nearly 60 years. Late in his life, he sat down and set out his own first-person account of those 18 extraordinary nights, so that the story would not be lost, and it is from that account, carefully checked against the Navy's own records, that we can be as confident as we are about what truly happened in the dark over Korea. It is worth asking why a man who achieved something so genuinely unique is so little remembered today. Part of the answer is simply the war he fought in. Korea has often been called the Forgotten War, wedged between the vast moral clarity of the Second World War and the long trauma of Vietnam, and much of what happened there slipped out of public memory almost as soon as the guns went quiet. Part of the answer is the nature of the mission itself. There is no glamour in it, no dawn patrol, and no duel of champions high in a blue sky. Bourdalone's victories were won in darkness against obsolete aircraft in a campaign that the High Command found more embarrassing than heroic, and that did not lend itself to a triumphant headline. And part of the answer is simply the kind of man he was. He did not seek attention. His name appeared in the citations, the reports were filed, the photographs were taken, and then the whole affair receded quietly into the archives, as so much of that war did. It took decades and his own late decision to write down what had happened for the full shape of the achievement to become clear. It would be easy to let the story end right there, with a good man and his old fighter and a war gone finally quiet. But the reason this small, half-forgotten episode still matters, the real reason it is worth your time 70 years after the fact, is that the problem Bourdalogne faced never actually went away at all. It only changed its clothes. Think once more about what really happened over Korea. The most powerful air force in the world, equipped with the fastest and most advanced flying machines yet built by human hands, was held at bay night after night after night by aircraft made of wood and fabric, aircraft so cheap and so simple that they could be built and replaced faster than they could ever be shot down. The lesson buried inside that fact is one of the most important in all of modern warfare, and it is deeply uncomfortable for any rich and technologically confident nation to sit with. Sophistication is not the same thing as effectiveness. A weapon that is cheap, simple, hard to detect, and available in large numbers can impose enormous costs on an enemy who has spent a fortune on speed and altitude and precision. The expensive, brilliant machine is optimized for the wrong fight. The cheap, humble machine slips in underneath all of that brilliance and does its damage regardless. Bourdalogne and his Corsair were, in the end, the exception that proves the rule, because the only way anyone found to beat the cheap little raiders was to reach back into the recent past and find an aircraft nearly as humble as they were, one slow enough to meet them on their own strange terms. That lesson did not stay safely locked in 1953. It is alive on the Korean peninsula at this very moment. North Korea today is believed to operate a fleet of roughly 250 Antonov biplanes and light transports, the An-2, a slow, fabric-skinned aircraft that is, in a very real and direct sense, the descendant of Bedcheck Charlie's Po-2. They are kept not out of poverty or nostalgia, but for a deliberate purpose. Flying low and slow, they return almost nothing on radar, and they are meant to carry North Korean special forces over the border and deep behind enemy lines in exactly the kind of quiet night infiltration that the old raiders first pioneered over these same hills. The threat is taken seriously enough that South Korea has reportedly acquired a small number of An-2 aircraft of its own, painted up in North Korean style markings, for the single purpose of letting its modern pilots practice the maddening, decades-old problem of how to catch something that flies too slowly to be caught. The exact riddle that Bordelon solved in a borrowed patch of sky in 1953 is still being set today as a live training exercise for the fighter pilots of a new century. And the lesson reaches far beyond Korea. In the wars of our own time, the very same principle has come roaring back in a new and even sharper form. The small, cheap, uncrewed aircraft that now fill the skies over modern battlefields, the drones that have reshaped war in the space of a few short years, are the direct intellectual grandchildren of the Night Raider. They are inexpensive. They can be launched in large numbers. They fly low and slow, sliding beneath the very systems built at vast expense to stop fast, high-flying threats. And they force the most advanced militaries on Earth to spend staggering sums trying to counter a machine that may cost only a tiny fraction as much to build and to fly. Professional military journals now draw the line directly back from today's drone problem to the night hecklers of Korea, because the underlying puzzle really is one and the same. What do you do when the cheap thing can hurt you and the expensive thing cannot catch it? The answer that the United Nations stumbled toward in 1953 after years of failure and frustration was not more speed, and it was not more technology. It was the right tool, chosen deliberately and without pride, even when that tool happened to be old. The daylight over Korea belonged to the Jets, and the history books have remembered them well. But the night belonged, for a long and humiliating stretch, to aircraft that by every rule of logic should have been obsolete. It took one man in a fighter the world had already begun to throw away to prove that the night could be taken back at all. Guy Bordelon flew straight into the darkness at an enemy he could barely see, 5 separate times across 18 nights, and in doing so, he answered a question that the fastest fighters on the planet could not answer. His name is not famous. He wrote no best-selling memoir, sat for no grand interviews, and chased no spotlight. He simply did the thing that badly needed doing, and then he went quietly on with the rest of his life. But the question he answered in the dark over Korea has never truly been closed. It is being asked again right now over other battlefields by other crews staring at faint traces on glowing screens, wondering how on earth to catch something that refuses to fly fast. The machines have changed beyond all recognition. The problem has not changed at all.